Hello, this is Fatih from TrafficTalks. Today we are launching our channel with our very first episode with Dan Feferman from the Jewish People Policy Institute. We're going to talk about differences between Reform, Conservative and Ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel and all around the world, and how their differences affect current affairs in Israel.
My book that I published in 2018 was called Rising Streams, and it looked at the Reform and Conservative, i.e. liberal streams of Judaism in Israel. And the reason we got into this, I did this with the Jewish People Policy Institute, where I'm a research fellow, is because there was a question if these liberal streams were even prominent within the Israeli reality. Anybody who knows a little bit about the Jewish world and the Jewish communities around the world knows that the Reform and Conservative are the main, by far the most prominent communities outside of Israel, especially in North America. They make up close to 90% of America's roughly 6 million Jews. And a few studies had shown, surveys had shown that a growing percentage of Jews in Israel were identifying as Reform or Conservative. This is from around 2009 and onwards. So we wanted to see, we ran our own study as well, which showed a surprising but not detached number of 13% of Israeli Jews identifying as Reform and Conservative. And yet when I dived into the subject, I found that very few Israelis are active in Reform or Conservative synagogues or communities. And so we set out to understand what this means. The conclusion I reached was a bit of a groundbreaking conclusion, changing how we understand religious identity, Jewish identity in Israel. And that is, for decades, for most of Israel's short reality, okay, I'm including the 70 years of the state and including a few of the pre-state decades prior to 1948, Israeli Jews were primarily secular or traditional. Very few of them were actively religious, but they were secular or traditional in relation to Orthodox Judaism. It was the only legitimate form of Judaism. And so there was a kind of a half joke that we used to explain this and say the synagogue that these Jews did not attend was an Orthodox one. I don't know if you have the same kind of thing where you're from, but this was for a long time. And it's very different from the American experience or prior to the Holocaust, the Western European experience, where there were multiple streams and multiple forms of Judaism, and you could choose which kind of synagogue you did or did not go to. And what I identified as the major change was one that Israelis, due to globalization, due to greater interaction with American Jewry, due to postmodern understandings of religion and religious identity and how it fits into their life, are starting to accept these non-Orthodox, or we'll call them post-Orthodox, forms of Judaism as legitimate and relevant to their lives. However, because they are not religious people, they are secular people, they're secular traditional people, it only comes into play in their lives at key moments, whether it is when there is a baby or a bar mitzvah, a coming of age ceremony, or a wedding, or God forbid, a funeral. These are the kind of moments when Judaism comes into the lives of the average Israeli Jew. The average Israeli Jew is not religious on a daily level, but they are traditional, very much so. And for those key moments, you don't necessarily need a synagogue. You don't necessarily need a rabbi. But what we found and what we concluded was that for these kind of peak moments in the lives of the Israeli Jew, non-Orthodox, liberal, post-Orthodox forms of Judaism were becoming more and more prevalent and more legitimate.
Then I want to ask, Reform Jews, we've seen more like a secular Jews, so to say, comparing to Ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. What made them change their behaviors? If you take Ultra-Orthodox communities' way of life, way of thinking, way of believing as the basis of Judaism in all over the world, how Reform Jews decided this type of thinking? I mean, should we say, how did they change or how did they evolve, let's say?
Sure, that's a good question. I mean, to ask that kind of question assumes, and it would be a common assumption, but a mistaken one, that ultra-Orthodoxy is the original, let's say, Judaism. Both ultra-Orthodox and Reform Judaism, to a lesser extent conservative Judaism, are adaptations to modernity. They're adaptations to the Enlightenment. These are ways in which around the time of the Enlightenment in the 1800s, primarily in Europe. This did not happen for Middle Eastern Jews, by the way. This did not happen for Sephardic Middle Eastern Jews. This happened for European and later American Jews. And this has to do with the influences of Protestantism being a modernization, an adaptation of the Christian religion, much in the same way that, let's say, Eastern Orthodoxy or Catholicism or Islam have not adapted to modernity in the same way that Protestantism. So Reform Judaism is essentially an adaptation to modernity. It was an attempt for Jews at that time period to answer the question, how can I be a modern person of science? How can I be a full citizen of my society and still maintain my Judaism? The initial reaction, and this is less the case today, but the initial reaction was to separate the concept of Jewish peoplehood. For centuries, we have looked at ourselves as a people who have a religion, but we are the Jewish people. If you look through our texts, if you look through our language, our writings throughout centuries and centuries, and all of a sudden you see Western European and then later American Jews calling themselves a faith in the Western idea of what it means to be Jewish. A big part of this had to do with dropping outside aesthetics, ways of dress, ways of eating. You know, Jews have a specific way of eating kosher food. They dropped those kind of things. They, in large part, stopped observing the Sabbath in a traditional manner in order to integrate in society. And they made an attempt, an intellectual, philosophical attempt to try to understand maybe what are the key tenets of what it means to be Jewish in a Protestant understanding and try to adapt those. Of course, this has adapted over the years, as has Protestantism, and it is far more traditional today than it was 100 or 150 years ago. Ultra-Orthodoxy, it's interesting, was also an adaptation to modernity, but the opposite reaction. It sought to close itself off from the modern world, from corrupting influences of modernization and science, etc., and maintain this concept of the Eastern European shtetl, or the Jewish village, the enclosed, all-encompassing community in which the leading figure was a rabbi and were the Jewish elders. And so this is an attempt, it's a romanticized attempt, because that is not how the stringency with which they practice their faith and which they observe their commandments. The stringency, for example, the way in which women are relegated often, as we would see it from the outside perhaps, to a secondary role in society is not something that existed 50 or 100 years ago. So in a romanticized way, they also view themselves as doing what the original Judaism is, but this is also far from it in the opposite direction.
Dan, we know that in ultra-Orthodoxy, there is a concept of Messiah, and also waiting Messiah actively and also waiting Messiah passively. How Reformed Jews see Messiah? Do you think that they have a concept of Messiah, or do they believe that they should wait for him or her, I don't know, wait for him just to make it like, just let's say, to make it Israel more a religious country because of ultra-Orthodoxy? Some of those ultra-Orthodox do not even consider Israel as a Jewish state, and they were saying that before Messiah comes, we cannot build a state that is a Jewish state. What do you think about that?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, the concept of the Messiah, of course, it's an old one in Jewish thought. It's actually not found in the earliest texts. It's not found in the Torah, in the Bible, but it does come later in the writings of the prophets and, of course, later on. Traditionally, Jews have held that there will be a time when a descendant of King David comes forth and brings about this end of times, so to speak, in a very positive way, and the way the world works, sorrow, etc. All these things that will be gone. I'm not an expert on this particular thing. Reform Jews originally did away with this concept as well, along with the theme of doing away with a lot of concepts that they viewed as outdated or not in line with modern norms. So originally they did away with it, and eventually they came to a sort of understanding that there might be this messianic era, as opposed to a specific figure who brings about a better, a more just kind of world. And it's also part of their role in history to kind of bring about this by doing good deeds, deeds of justice, helping the poor, etc. But it's not a hard concept among non-Orthodox Jews. Among Orthodox Jews, while there are disagreements, it's a much harder concept that this is something that will eventually happen. Now, here's the split within Orthodoxy happened between what we call religious Zionists, in Hebrew datim leumim, or nationalist religious, and the ultra-Orthodox, who are not nationalists, they're not Zionist in their approach. And religious Zionism was also an adaptation to modernity and to the creation of Israel. And it was a dialectic which brought together, it viewed the establishment of the state of Israel and all its early successes as the way they described in religious terms, Chalta de Geulta, right? The beginnings of the redemption process. So even if the state was not founded by Torah-observant religious Jews, the religious Zionist section of society views this in a religious terminology, that these Jews were playing a role in history and that this is the beginning of a redemptive process. Whereas the ultra-Orthodox, even if they today are supportive of the state in, let's say, matter-of-fact terms, they do not believe it is part of this process. It is separate from the one-day Messiah that will come and resurrect the third temple and the proper Israel according to religious lines.
Let's jump to today, if you want. We know that Reform Jews, most of them based in the United States, are contributing to economy, and from ultra-Orthodox part, we see that in a community that do not contribute economy that much. We know that they are changing also now. They're also attending this workforce. They're also learning this mathematics. Even they learn how to write some computer programs. But I want to know the difference, and also in terms of economy and politics. How do you think that Reform Jews, especially from the United States, affecting United States and Israel relations? But we know that Reform Jews have some problems with Benjamin Netanyahu recently. What do you think about that?
Well, let's take that question by question, because there are a few in there. So, yeah, the American Jewish community, by and large, which is Reform or conservative or generally more liberal, in large part is deeply supportive of Israel, but has a lot of problems with Netanyahu and with the current government, or let's say the governments of the right. Much of this has to do with two main issues, maybe even three main issues. And it aligns with a lot of the way the Israeli left views these issues as well. So we can compare the way most liberal American Jews view Israel in the same terms that we say the Israeli left views these issues. The first is they have a very strong desire to end the conflict with the Palestinians in a way that results in a two-state solution, to end the occupation. And this is something that has always been a high priority item for most American Jews, even if they realize that it might not be realistic because of lack of a desire on both sides at this time, without getting into the politics of that. But that still remains one of these issues, and they have tended to view Netanyahu and the parties with whom he aligns as not sincere in their efforts to do enough to reach peace and to reach a two-state solution. And now you have talks among the Israeli right of annexation of possible parts of Judea and Samaria, of the West Bank. And that would cause even greater tensions between most American Jews and the Israeli government. The second issues relate to the control and the power that the ultra-Orthodox especially have here within the political system, and how they use that to ensure the monopoly or the near monopoly of Orthodox Judaism over state institutions, and more in recent years, ultra-Orthodox Judaism. So they would like to see an Israel that is a lot more pluralistic. Now, there are, a couple of issues that have to do with this. Is one, and the largely fair argument that a lot of Israelis will tell our Reform and conservative brothers and sisters in the United States, well, there just aren't that many Reform and conservative Jews here. And now that goes against, of course, everything I wrote and everything we discussed at the beginning of the conversation. But if we look at it on a surface level, it is largely true. If we get into the deeper questions, as we discussed, it's changing and it's not true at all. And then you have the question is, as a matter of principle, even if there are not, let's say, a lot of Reform or conservative Jews, should Israel be more pluralistic in these regards? And this came largely to the fore a couple of years back on the issue of the Western Wall and the effort to have a compromise agreement that would open a third egalitarian section of the Western Wall, which does exist currently, but it is not funded and does not have a legal official status equal to the other two traditional sections of the wall. And something that bothers a lot of Israelis that has to do with marriage. I don't know if you're aware, if you are two Jews in Israel, you have no option to get married legally inside of Israel other than through the Orthodox chief rabbinate. If you are a Jew and a non-Jew, you do not have any option to get legally married inside of Israel. Of course, you can go outside of Israel and that marriage will be recognized, but you cannot conduct that in Israel. So those are two major things that the American Jewish community, leaving the Orthodox aside, have issues with Israel and specifically with Netanyahu and the governments that he's led.
So you explain it very well again, as you do always. I want to know, those ultra-Orthodox Jews, Reform Jews, there are lots of differences, and how historically they evolved. Why there are lots of differences between those people. Their beliefs are, we know that they believe in the same God, they believe the same tradition, but why did they change? Is it because in the geographies they are living in, is the United States or Europe? Because we know that most of the Orthodox in Israel actually coming from Europe, and those reforms most probably also European. But why did they change? Why there are lots of differences between them?
Yeah, actually, while the concept of Reform Judaism and the concept of ultra-Orthodox Judaism came from Europe or through Europe through America, in the case of the Reform, today you have plenty of ultra-Orthodox Jews who are of Middle Eastern descent, Sfardim or Mizrahim, and you also have plenty of those Israelis who are more leaning towards liberal kinds of Judaism, who are also Sfaradim and Mizrahim. So both of those trends in Israeli society, both of those phenomenon, have become general Israeli trends and are not solely European Jews for European descent. But as I said, they came out of an attempt by both groups to confront modernity, to confront the Enlightenment, ideas of the Enlightenment. So you have some Jews who took the ideas of the Enlightenment and ran away with modern nationalism. And they tried to meld Judaism with modern nationalism, and that was the start of the modern Zionist movement. American Jews did the opposite, right? Instead of dropping, so if the Zionists kind of dropped the religion at the beginning, they're now coming back to it, and that's part of the other story. Reform Jews dropped the nationalism and stuck only to the faith. And they tried to ask questions, well, what is the point of being Jewish, and can we keep these points while being modern citizens of modern societies? And the ultra-Orthodox, we all start with the same book. We all start with the Torah, the Old Testament, right? Um, um, but ultra-Orthodox society is based entirely on following a codified set of rules from the 15 and then the 1700s, very strict rules in which there are tons and tons of books on exactly what those rules mean and how you follow them strictly. And whereas Reform Jews, even if most of them are not even aware of these rules, but if they are, these rules are more suggestions, they're more traditions. Um, Now, you could say, is this the same thing as secular Jews who also don't follow these rules? Well, the problem that the ultra-Orthodox have with the Reform Jews is that the Reform Jews took their dismissal of this rule book and the authority of the rabbis and the primacy of tradition, and they let's say, I don't want to say threw it out because that's disrespectful, but they, respectfully threw it out. They did away with it. The ultra-Orthodox claim that the Reform essentially created a new religion that maybe started in Judaism but is no longer Judaism. Whereas the Reform see themselves as the next evolution of Judaism, and with the ultra-Orthodox clinging to the minutiae, clinging to the trees and missing the forest, so to speak. So there is a deep agreement, a deep fundamental theological agreement between the two about which one of them is keeping the spirit and the authentic Judaism. One says the other is missing the point, and of course they're the ones who are keeping the authentic, legitimate Judaism.
Let's jump to today's relations. The coronavirus outbreak in Israel, in the Middle East, and all over the world. And we know that most of the cases in Israel are coming from ultra-Orthodox people. First question, why mostly from ultra-Orthodox people? And second, do you think that in the near future or in the future that we will follow for many years will change the rift or deepen the rift between seculars and ultra-Orthodox community in Israel?
So we'll talk briefly about the corona. The ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, also outside of Israel, was hit hardest by the coronavirus, both in terms of number of infected, in terms of number of people in the hospitals. And this had largely to do with the fact that this is a society that is not connected to the internet. They don't watch the nightly news as most of the rest of Israel does. They don't have smartphones and they're not getting news updates. So in large part, they were unaware of what was happening in the rest of the country. There is a tendency, a deep mistrust of the government, the police, and the media in this public, who they often view as trying to push them and pressure them to drop their clinging to tradition. They view themselves as the guardians of tradition in a very deep and real way. And so when the police were going through the neighborhoods initially, trying to get people to abide by the social distancing and the quarantine, etc., they viewed it as being singled out for unfair pressure. It is only when about a week or two after the rest of the country was already staying indoors and abiding by the rules that the government began, through its various arms, began speaking to this public in a language that they understand, through influencers that they can understand, through means that they can understand. Then they, for the most part, also started abiding by these rules. And then you saw the numbers across the entire country now have dropped down to very low levels, to the point where earlier this week, just last night, the Prime Minister is announced that they're starting to relax the restrictions little by little, and that's across the board. So it was largely a matter of just, they work on a different wavelengths. I should also mention they live in more crowded neighborhoods, much larger families, smaller apartments, and they have a much more communal lifestyle on a day-to-day level that led to a faster outbreak and a more delayed response in this community. But all that has changed, and we seem to be on a good trajectory here. Remind me your second question.
Yeah, the question was about the rift between secular and
Right.
Orthodox people, because we know that there were lots of criticism from secular part to ultra-Orthodox part, because first,
Sure.
they do not pay taxes, they do not go and serve in the army,
Yeah.
and
Well,
stay.
part of that's not true, but it's myths about the
Yeah,
community.
yeah,
The part about taxes is something that the Israeli mainstream and the Israeli left like to use. It's only true so much as that there are just a lot of poor families within this public, and poor families in general get subsidies. Families with large children, large families with many children in general get these subsidies, tax breaks, etc. So you could be a secular poor large family, and you would also get the same treatment by the government. A lot of it is not true. They do, as an ideal, not serve in the military, and that is one of the main tensions between the secular traditional part of society and the ultra-Orthodox. I can answer that question too. There's two major trends here. One major trend is that for the most part, the bigger section of ultra-Orthodox society is integrating in the country. Certainly getting more education and being integrated in the workforce, as many of them have seen the value and want to live a more comfortable middle-class lifestyle. So you see the participation rates in higher education growing. You see participation in the workforce growing. By the way, in their society, usually it's the woman who is more educated and has the job. The ideal, if you talk to most ultra-Orthodox families, the ideal situation would be that the woman has a high-paying job and supports the family, freeing the man to go and study Torah and Talmud, Jewish law, the entire day, and to become a religious scholar. So this is the ideal of their society. Of course, it's harder and harder in a modern society. And so things are changing. You see more and more education, workforce participation. That's for the majority of them. Of course, there is, I think, a minority, I don't have the numbers with me, that is becoming maybe more radicalized, more insulated, maybe clinging to this more. And of course, their political leadership. We here in Israel have a direct representational political system in which you have to build coalitions. And so the two main political parties that represent the ultra-Orthodox, one is Ashkenazi European, the other is Sephardic Middle East. They, in many ways, prolong the rift, prolong the lack of service or participation in the military, prolong the subsidies that prevent them from joining the workforce. I can see a situation in which we have less of a rift over time, just as much as I can see the other kind of situation. It's really hard to tell. It depends a lot on what their leaders decide to do, and also if their demographic growth rates continue as expected, or if they change. They could have, they are having smaller families, and this could also continue, and it could throw all our guesses and estimations out the window. So it could very easily go in one way as much as it goes in the other way.
Now you talked many estimations. You talked about many estimations. We know that birth rate among Ultra-Orthodox communities around 7.7, and we know that
I believe it's around 6, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, this is what I get is around 7.7.
Okay.
And also we know that in Israeli parliament they have a veto power. They have parties there, and the health minister is from UTJ,
Yes.
from among Orthodox community. Do you think that in the near future we will see a different political landscape in Israel? Can we see more Orthodox people can make it into Knesset in the near future because of the population growth among Orthodox Jews?
I mean, if it continues, you'll see a constant growing trajectory of the size of the two ultra-Orthodox parties. Right now, I believe there are around 7 or 8 apiece for the two of them. The ultra-Orthodox, I believe, are currently 10 or 11% of, about 10% of the country, and growing fast. As you mentioned, they have the highest birth rates. And so it's very easy to imagine a situation in another generation in which the two ultra-Orthodox parties, represent a bigger part of society. They can also count on their voters to get out and vote, and only vote for them. Whereas, for example, the religious Zionist parties have not managed to represent their percentage in society over 10%, but they have not managed to grow as a response to that, because you have many people who are religious Zionists voting for Likud, for example, and also a few for blue and white and for other kinds of parties. So with the ultra-Orthodox, they have a good voter turnout, they have good voter discipline, party loyalty, things that few of the other parties, except maybe the Arab parties, can count on.
Dan, thank you very much. It was very clear and a good talk. And
My
thank
pleasure.
you very much. Thank you very much for being with us on our very first episode on Traffic Talks. And let's be in touch for next project.
Thank you. I was glad to be here.
Thank you very much for watching our very first episode of Traffic Talks. We will keep digging for more information and deeper analysis of current affairs, economy, and international relations.